When the Jets open training camp next week, all eyes will be on the big man, but there are some other key storylines to keep an eye on, and we'll discuss them today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, July 15th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast, just give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Well, training camp for the New York Jets in 2024 gets underway next week, a very anticipated season for the New York Jets. Let's talk about the top storylines for the New York Jets as they prepare to enter training camp. And I think that the obvious number one storyline will be the return of Aaron Rodgers. That's doesn't take a lot of deep analysis to figure that one out. Rodgers is the quarterback. The quarterback is always scrutinized. When you have a guy who's a Hall of Fame level quarterback, the scrutiny goes even deeper. When it's a guy like Aaron Rodgers coming back from an injury, all eyes are going to be on him. And I think, if anything, maybe what happens in training camp will be a little over scrutinized, but I think much of the over scrutiny will be a positive thing because training camp is kind of set up to favor the offense. There's not really a lot of contact. Even the days where the team conducts padded practices, it's not that intense. The quarterback cannot be hit. The quarterback typically wears a red jersey, and the red jersey means you are not allowed to hit the quarterback for obvious reasons. You don't want the quarterback to get injured in practice. So all of these things really kind of play to the offense's advantage. And I think Rodgers is already, a quarterback with a Hall of Fame pedigree. So it's not like he's going to go out there and succeed only because only because the practices favor him. He's also a great quarterback. But you'll be hearing a lot about, Rodgers looks great. Rodgers looks fantastic. You'll hear a lot about the Achilles. I think, with the Achilles, you would assume everything's fine. We're going to be, 10, 11 months away from that injury. Once training camp begins, and that's a normal time frame for Rodgers to be back. I mean, the Jets were talking about putting him on the field at the end of last season, and he was actually warming up during games last season. And for everything I've learned about how Achilles injuries heal is the injury itself, heals pretty quickly. The issue with putting him on the field last year would be the risk for re-injury. If he was going to be hit, Rodgers was probably healthy enough to, not probably, he was healthy enough to participate in practices near the end of the season. The real danger, from returning quickly from an Achilles injury is, taking a hit and the risk is higher of re-injuring it. That risk goes down once you're, a year out. So, I don't think there should be any real concern about Rodgers recovering from his Achilles, but, you'll hear a lot about it. You'll hear a lot about Rodgers. Rodgers will tell you a lot about how it feels great, and I'm sure it does. And this is, good information. It'll give the Jets, a little positive buzz as they enter the season. I'm sure he's going to play very well in the training camp practices for the reasons I mentioned. Training camp practices just favor the offense. I don't think any of these are necessarily that significant, though. I talk a lot about how the offseason practices, the OTAs, really don't matter all that much. I'll put it this way. When have you ever gotten to, October or November and thought that how the team performed or how a player performed in OTAs had a meaningful impact on whether the team succeeded or failed? You never do. Training camp is only slightly more important from that standpoint. Now, I think it's more significant because you're actually getting ready for the season. So from that standpoint, it can matter a little bit more, only slightly. But the stuff that would matter for Rodgers, I don't think is necessarily all that relevant. In recent shows, I've talked about some of the differences between Rodgers coming to the Jets from the last time the Jets traded for a Hall of Fame Packers quarterback. That was Brett Favre back in 2008. And with Favre, it was kind of a tough situation because the Jets made a trade for him right before their first preseason game. They were well into training camp. I think it was the night before their first preseason game. They were in Cleveland to play the Browns. And it was very disruptive to bring in a quarterback at that point of the calendar, when you don't get the full training camp under your belt. And it was doubly disruptive for Favre because he was coming from Green Bay and he had to learn a new system run by Brian Schottenheimer that, for everything I understand, had a very different terminology from what he was used to all his years in Green Bay, playing for coaches like Mike McCarthy and Mike Sherman and Mike Holmgren. So Favre had to learn a new offense, and you could see, especially at the early points of that season, Favre was not entirely comfortable with the offense the Jets were running. Now, for Rodgers, well, first of all, this is year 2 with the Jets. He already had training camp last year. And look, Nathaniel Hackett's an awful coach. Nathaniel Hackett should not be the offensive coordinator of this team. There are lots of reasons for that. The one thing that's actually a benefit for the Jets having Nathaniel Hackett is that Rodgers is very comfortable with the system. Now, part of the reason Rodgers is very comfortable with the system is Hackett lets him do whatever he wants. And Hackett doesn't really bring much to the table, in my opinion. But there's a benefit because Rodgers is comfortable in the system. Now, if this was a different scenario, if it was like a Favre type scenario, we could be looking at training camp and saying, well, how is Rodgers adapting to the new system? And that would be something worth watching, but it's not really on the table this year. I think the one thing that I would keep an eye on, and they don't televise the training camp practices, so you'll have to lean on reports. But I think the one thing that could be worth keeping an eye on is just how is Rodgers developing chemistry with the receivers? And again, this is his second training camp, so in terms of talking about Garrett Wilson, it's more about rekindling chemistry. There was a lot of positive buzz about the Rodgers Wilson connection a year ago in training camp. There was a lot of excitement about Garrett Wilson finally having a quality quarterback throwing the ball. And of course, that did not last very long. I don't think Garrett Wilson had a single target from Rodgers once the games began last year. So it's a question of rekindling, that chemistry that started to flourish last summer. Some of the other guys, Mike Williams, doesn't sound like Mike Williams can be ready for the start of training camp, but that's a very important connection. The Jets will need to get going, the Rodgers Mike Williams connection, because Mike Williams is on paper a very high end number 2 receiver. He's if you had told me heading into the offseason Jets would be able to get Mike Williams on a 1-year contract, you would have had a very happy podcast host, because Mike Williams is a really solid receiver. And beyond that, not only is Mike Williams a good receiver, Mike Williams does a lot of the things Garrett Wilson struggles with. And that's, particularly when we're talking about contested catches, when we're talking about just beating press coverage off the line. When Garrett struggles, and it doesn't happen that often, but when Garrett struggles, it frequently happens when he's up against more physical, bigger corners, stronger corners, because that's not really Garrett's game. Garrett's game has a lot of subtlety to it. It has a lot of nuance to it. He's a heck of a route runner. He figured out how to create separation and shake guys. He's not small. He's not like Elijah Moore level small, but he's a little undersized at the receiver position. Not to the point where it really impacts him all that much, but one of the areas where it can impact him are the winning the ball at a contested catch point, and getting off the line of scrimmage against some of the better press corners in the league. So Mike Williams adds another element that I think Rodgers will really like. In fact, I would say. And, everybody wants to bash Allen Lazard. And look, I was never a fan of the signing. Mike Williams is like the player everybody imagined Allen Lazard was going to be a year ago. Allen Lazard was big. He wasn't a good contested catch guy. He wasn't, a great guy off the line of scrimmage against press coverage. People just assumed because he was big, he could do these things when there was no real evidence he could do them. Mike Williams can do these things. Mike Williams will add an excellent element to this offense. So, to the extent Williams, not in the lineup yet. I think another question will be, Xavier Gipson. There's a lot of buzz about that one. We'll see how good Gipson is. For a lot of players, the biggest improvements between year 1 and year 2. A lot of buzz out of the offseason program about Gipson. We'll see whether it carries over to training camp. But, something worth watching at least, as Gipson will presumably battle with Malachi Corley for playing time out of the slot. And then, of course, our buddy Lazard. Who knows what his role with the offense will be. I'm sure he'll have some sort of role, like it or not. So to the extent, the reports out of training camp matter. Look, Rodgers is going to look good. Rodgers is going to tell you, and it'll be true, that the Achilles is fine. These are things we know. I think the question will be the degree to which he's getting on the same page with these receivers, and that'll be something worth watching. Now, of course, not every training camp storyline is based on what happens on the field. Sometimes it's about negotiations. As we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets, Jets have a couple of negotiations they need to figure out to get some key guys into training camp. We'll talk about who they are. They're the two pretty key players, and we'll go into more detail on that continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. Our episode of Locked On Jets today is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all at prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. But it's not just baseball. You can find tickets for anything on Gametime. You can find Jets tickets as we get ready for the upcoming season. I've used Gametime plenty myself. I used it to go to the U.S. Open last year, to the Holiday Bowl in San Diego. Even found tickets for a great Broadway musical last autumn, and it's just so easy to use. I found all of these tickets last minute, just a couple hours before the event started. I could not believe the deal. It's absolutely amazing. This app is fantastic, and it's easy to use. Some of the other ticket websites, some of the other ticket apps, a little bit complex. Gametime, pull out your phone or mobile device, a couple of clicks, you have a great deal at a price you can afford. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you every dayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And yes, we're back to our regular schedule. We took a little bit of a reduced schedule through much of the summer, but now we're back. Today is the first day we're back in our normal schedule. So we will have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. We'll carry you through the season, through the NFL offseason. Very exciting year for the New York Jets. But before it gets underway, they have a couple contractual things to deal with. And, one of them I would imagine is going to get done pretty quickly. They still have one unsigned draft pick, and that's Malachi Corley, the guy they traded up for at the top of the third round. I can't imagine there's going to be a third round holdout. So I think they'll get that deal done. I don't know what the holdup has been. The key thing is the Jets got their first round picks in on time. And so that's, it's nice. It's nice that it's nice that the first pick, Olu Fashanu, is signed. And the Jets have been the one team in the NFL that's really struggled getting their first round picks signed on time since the advent of the rookie wage scale back in 2011. D. Milner back in 2013 could not get in on time. Zach Wilson and Sam Darnold, last two times the Jets picked a quarterback in the first round, Quinnen Williams. It's happened over the course of 3 general manager tenures. So what does that tell you? It tells you probably ownership's the issue on that. But they just have their first round pick signed. So I'm not worried about Corley. If they just can't get Corley signed, then we'll deal with it then. The bigger issue is Haason Reddick, who wants a new contract. And I have to tell you that I'm very confused about how the Jets handled this whole situation, because they traded for him when he had made it clear that he wanted a new contract. The reason the Eagles were trading it, one of the biggest reasons the Eagles were looking to trade him, was that they didn't want to pay him. They didn't want to give him a new contract. It was widely known across the league that Haason Reddick wanted a new contract. And now here the Jets sitting acting shocked. And, there were things that came out once Reddick did not show up to OTAs, but nobody reported that the Jets and Reddick had agreed to a deal that he was playing under his current salary this year. There were implications the Jets made assumptions, but nobody, at least I haven't seen anybody say that the Jets and Reddick had agreed to a deal. So I don't think I've ever seen a player get traded to a new team and immediately embark on a contract dispute. Normally, when you trade for a player, you have the contract worked out. So how does this end? There have been some reports the Jets are not interested in extending Reddick. So generally what happens in a situation like this is the team and player, they work out some sort of compromise where, if the Jets don't want to give him an extension, maybe they, boost his salary a little bit. They do so. They give him some sort of sweetener, show some goodwill, allow him to save face. Reddick's a really key player for the Jets this year. He's a fantastic pass rusher, one of the most effective pass rushers, one of the most effective players in the league at getting to the quarterback over the last 4 seasons. And you put him on the defensive line with Quinnen Williams, you're going to create problems for the other team's offense. I always say this, that you can double team one guy, because you would think about it. It's 5 offensive linemen versus 4 defensive linemen on most plays. So that means you can double team one guy. But when Quinnen Williams and Haason Reddick are on the field at the same time, that means one of the two is going to see single team. Then one of the two is going to get blocked one-on-one every single play when they're on the field. And that's not. And look, the Jets have other talented players on this defensive line, especially at the defensive end position. So Jets. You have Jermaine Johnson still. You have Will McDonald, who's going to be looking to make a jump in year 2. there are a lot of talented players on this defensive line for the New York Jets. So it's not just these two, but these are the two like real stars on this defensive line. And I also always say this, that when there are two things you want to be able to do in the NFL on the defensive side of the ball. You want to be able to get to the quarterback. You want to be able to cover receivers. And when the Jets have, I would say, the top corner trio in the league, it's Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed, and Michael Carter II. So if you can get to the quarterback and cover guys, you're in pretty good shape. And the two relationships kind of interact with each other, because if you have defensive linemen who can get to the quarterback, well, your corners don't have to cover for as long. If you've got corners who can cover, your defensive linemen have more time to get to the quarterback. So this defense is very, on paper, it looks very well built. The question of getting Haason Reddick in, and we'll see how much Reddick is willing to escalate this. We don't really know yet. It's one thing to sit out OTA. It's one thing to sit out the optional part of the offseason program, which he did. It's another to sit out the mandatory training, mandatory mini camp, which he did. It's still another to hold out of training camp. And it's still another to hold out once the regular season games begin. I don't think Reddick has escalated it to a wide degree yet. Now, skipping the mandatory minicamp, that's a sign that there could be some sort of trouble on the horizon for the Jets, dealing with this player, but not necessarily. I haven't seen anything yet to suggest that Reddick is definitely going to hold out of training camp. But it behooves the Jets to figure the situation out and get him locked up, or get him back on the field sooner rather than later. I have to tell you, I'm a bit surprised by the way this has played out, because I assumed when the Jets traded for Reddick, they were going to work out a new contract for him, because they gave up a third-round pick. And I know it's not a third-round pick till 2026, but a third-round pick for the players, it's a pretty decent price, especially for a player who's about to hit 30. It's not, it's not like they gave up 2 first-round picks, but third-round pick is not a cheap price to give up to get a player. And usually you would not do it for a 1-year rental. So I'm not entirely sure what the Jets' strategy is with this. Now, it's conceivable that maybe the Jets gave up the third-round pick and they thought, we'll get 1 year out of Reddick, we'll let him leave, and we'll get a third-round compensatory pick back, which would come in 2026 anyway. Maybe that was the strategy, but considering the Jets seem to think Aaron Rodgers is going to play more than 1 year, it would be unusual, at least in my view, to see them embark on a strategy that would require them to not sign many free agents next year, because you only get compensatory picks if you lose more players than you sign. And if Rodgers is still on the team next year, I would imagine the Jets are still going to want to be pretty aggressive. So it's difficult for me to decipher exactly what the plan is with Reddick, or what the plan was when they traded for him, because now it doesn't seem like they were overly that concerned with getting him a new contract. I don't know how this ends. My guess is that they'll find some way to kind of meet Reddick in the middle again. Maybe not an extension, but maybe, they guarantee more money, something along those lines, give him some easy incentives to hit, something that allows Reddick to feel happy, get him back into the fold. Or, maybe they just play hardball and maybe Reddick caves. I don't know, but hopefully the situation gets resolved sooner rather than later. You don't want a distraction. You want Reddick in training camp. Now, is it a big deal if he sits out part of training camp? Not really, other than just a distraction at a point of the year where you're getting ready for the season. But you just don't want that. You just like to have Reddick. He's such a good player. You just want him in training camp. Speaking of guys you want in training camp, there's some guys coming off injuries for the Jets. As we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets, we'll talk about something to monitor during training camp, the recovery of some key players as they bounce back from 2023 injuries. And we'll talk about some of those players continuing here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Comparison is the theft of joy, and it's easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like they have it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. Therapy has so many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself, and it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Monday. We're talking about storylines once the Jets get training camp underway next week. Jets will start preparing for a highly anticipated season. Obviously, all eyes will be on Aaron Rodgers. All eyes will also be on guys who need to work out their contract situations in order to get into training camp. But I think there's another key aspect of training camp. It might be the most important out of all the things we mentioned because, like, a lot of the Rodgers stuff isn't really that big of a deal. We know Rodgers is going to play well in training camp. We know the Achilles is in a much better state. Obviously, it's important to get guys signed, but it's also important to see the guys who are recovering from injury get back on the field. And Jets have a number of key guys, whether we're talking Mike Williams, whether we're talking Elijah Vera Tucker, both players who this team will depend on quite a bit in the upcoming season. Now, for Williams, Robert Saleh, over the course of the offseason, suggested that he's kind of on the Breece Hall timeline. So what does that mean? Well, you may remember last year, Breece Hall was coming off a serious injury, just as Williams is this year. And Breece was not ready for the start of training camp. He started training camp on the physically unable to perform list, but he got back soon enough and, broke off a big run his first handoff from scrimmage in the 2023 season. So he was ready to go week one. I remember last year, I spent much of the offseason trying to get people to kind of take lower expectations for Breece in the early part of the season. I remember last year I talked a lot about how, we'll see how good he is in September. The key thing is for him to be ready to go for November and December. Well, he came out, was great right away. He had a remarkable recovery from a serious knee injury and was really great right out of the box. You hope the same for Mike Williams this year because he's a really important player for the Jets. I mean, how many times did we say it last year? Garrett Wilson was really the only quality target the Jets had in the passing game. And I know, Breece Hall obviously played well. Breece Hall obviously added a lot of catches and a lot of yards, but it wasn't because he was running great routes. It was more Jets had to check the ball down a lot. And listen, Breece Hall should see his fair share of targets in the passing game because Breece Hall's an explosive guy once he gets the ball in his hands. And it doesn't matter whether he gets a handoff or whether, he catches a check down or a screen. But, if we're talking about getting the ball down the field, the guys were running more conventional routes. Garrett Wilson could do that effectively. Jets did not have a second wide receiver who could do that because they were defending on Lazard, and he had Xavier Gibson, who was a rookie, who was doing his best. Later in the season, you had Jason Brownlee, who was a rookie, who was doing his best, but guys who were not really legitimate targets in the passing game. So, just monitoring Mike Williams' injury, and when I say monitoring Mike Williams' injury, go back to what I said about Breece Hall. I'm not saying that, we should panic if he's not on the field for the first practice of the year. We should not. It's all about getting ready for week one. And, sometimes people go overboard worrying about injuries that happen either before training camp or after training camp begins. And it's not worth doing it because you have to remember there's a long lead up period between training camp. Training camp begins in July. Jets don't play their first real game till like almost halfway through September. So there's plenty of time for guys to get healthy. And if Mike Williams doesn't begin the season on the practice field, that's fine. Elijah Vera Tucker, another guy worth watching. And look, the Jets' offensive line the last couple of years has been decimated by injury. Losing AVT has been a key point both seasons. I mean, I think like both years, losing Elijah Vera Tucker, both happened in games against Denver. That was kind of like the point of no return for the Jets on the offensive side of the ball, talking about their line, because their line really it not that the line was playing great before AVT went down, but he filled in so many different roles. He played so many different spots that I think there was a clear decline in play after he got injured. The Jets have said, Jets say this year they're going to keep him at right guard. They say, they said we're focused on one position. The theory seems to be that one of the reasons he may have gotten hurt is they keep moving him around and changing his technique, which maybe forces you to contort the body a different way. I mean, I don't know how true that is, but I do think the best thing for AVT is just to stick at guard. Look, when the Jets drafted him in 2021, they drafted him to play guard. And sometimes your players surprise you. Sometimes your initial evaluations are wrong and a player can do more than you're expecting. But everything I've seen suggests that, look, AVT, for a guy who had to move to a tackle in an emergency, I thought held up pretty well. But I really have come to feel like his home is at guard. So the question, will he be ready for training camp? But more importantly, will he be ready for week one? And if you've been listening to the show through the course of the spring and summer, I'm optimistic about it. I'm an AVT optimist. I think that, the skepticism around him is understandable because he has back-to-back seasons that ended in a serious injury. But I differentiate it from somebody like Mekhi Becton. Mekhi Becton suffered 2 straight knee injuries. And there was always a real possibility that, the knee just would never be the same with Becton. And we'll see how Becton does this year in a new home. AVT's injuries to me feel like the types of things that are, and just based on, the normal trajectory of player recovering from his injuries, they seem like the types of thing that should not hinder him in having a productive career. The question, though, is can he get back on the field? And I think obviously we'll be keeping an eye on him as we get deeper, as we begin training camp, and then as we get deeper, hopefully his health is up to par. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.